This body of work was started by us some years ago. We were part of a kind of wider movement of trying to lead innovation in children's services in relation to adolescent safeguarding, and a number of the authorities who took up this challenge so spectacularly well are represented in this room today. I wanted to just start by setting out the case for change. It's all stuff you know because of the kind of work you do, but it helps, I think, to have it set out for us in black and white. Now, adolescents have distinct safeguarding needs to younger children. We do not, in research and practice, we do not believe that requiring innovation in this field means you shouldn't be adhering to child protection standards and regulation. That's something that's often misunderstood. In our quest for innovation, we absolutely shouldn't be throwing out well-evidenced pieces of legislation and statutory guidance. I think what we would argue is the guidance and legislation we're working to is not designed for complex contemporary adolescent risk, and that's part of what makes your officer's job particularly difficult. We know that for adolescents in particular, their routes to harm are often extra-familial. So they're harmed by things outside of their family. They come into harm through their neighbourhoods, their peer groups, their school communities, the online world, which we call it that because we're ancient. Of course, young people just call it the world, don't they? It's not just their routes to harm can be extra-familial, their routes to protection and resilience can also be extra-familial. So we do need a slightly different approach to that, which is tried and tested in our work with child protection in intrafamilial harm, smaller children, younger children being harmed within the family. This second point feels so blindingly obvious, I'm almost embarrassed to have it on a slide, but we need to keep saying it because whilst colleagues in this room absolutely understand it, there is, I think, a challenge to help our national policy-making colleagues understand this issue. Harm doesn't stop at 18. The effects of harm don't stop at 18. What often stops at 18 is our support. We are the ones who walk away. The people who want to hurt our kids don't walk away, of course. The people who want to hurt our kids don't have complicated referral pathways. They don't have thresholds. They don't have difficult screening criteria which stop you. They don't gatekeep. In fact, the people who want to hurt our kids seem to have a far more advanced research and development arm than we do. And they're perfectly happy to innovate and adapt very nimbly in a way that our services often cannot. That's what we're up against. The transition to adulthood is a tough time. For most of us, actually, change is a bit difficult. Even positive change can be difficult. I'm reliably informed that divorce rates are exponentially higher amongst lottery winners, for example. General change can be difficult, and the transition to adulthood is a particularly challenging time for many young people. We need to reclaim the word transitions. Transitions has come to mean service language. It means pathways between learning disability services, for example, or transition from hospital to home for our older citizens. But it shouldn't mean that. It just means change. If I was to ask all of you to write down your most significant life transition, I expect you'd say things like, first time you got a proper job. I do hope you all feel that you have a proper job at this point. First time you got a proper job. First time you fell in love. First time you fell out of love. First time you became a parent. Those sorts of things. It's very unlikely you would say, I think it was the first time my key professional stopped having a .gov email address and started having a .nhs email address. We need to reclaim and rehumanize the language of transitions. We all need a bit of extra care and support when we're undergoing a transition. And we don't have to have care and support needs with a capital C and a capital S, as set out in the Care Act, to have these needs. We need to think about a way of safeguarding our adolescents and our young adults in a way which really promotes resilience and reflects their changing developmental needs rather than this rather static notion we have of childhood and adulthood. And we would argue that there are moral and economic drivers for a reimagined safeguarding system, which is, you could argue, contextual, transitional, and relational. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. I've taken this quote from Niall Balges, the Chief Exec at the London Borough of Hounslow, one of a number of local authorities who've been working with us and have expressed a real keen interest. I have got his permission to use this quote, I hasten to add. What Niall's saying here is something which you live every single day. The tension that Niall highlights is absolutely your bread and butter. People's problems transcend services. Unsurprisingly, they won't be remedied through individual services or directorates acting in isolation. As our corporate plan makes clear, successfully solving the problems people face is unlikely to be within the gift of the council alone. The nature of the problems faced by the council and our partners requires a different approach. A focus on long-term preventative interventions requires a different collaborative approach, bringing together partners from the public, private and voluntary sectors, as well as wider civil society. This isn't yet our default way of working. Very, very obvious, something you live every single day, but our safeguarding system, such as it could be called a contained system, does not embody this kind of knowledge and learning. And this is a systems issue, it's not a practice issue. I've recently, a bit of a diva move, I've started turning down offers to come and train practitioners in transitional approaches. I mean, by all means, pop an adult social worker in your CSE team. go for it. But it's not really about service level or practice level issues. This is a systems leadership endeavour. I've taken these 7 questions from the work of Frederick Vester. He's a German systems scientist. He's drawn a lot of the work on Dornus, some to be very familiar to you. If we think about, imagine we had a safeguarding system for 15 to 25-year-olds. Or if you're feeling really bold, 13 to 30-year-olds. See how innovative you're feeling. We might ask ourselves these questions of that so-called system. Have we defined our goals correctly to optimise the whole system? I'm not sure we have. When we ask colleagues working in children's safeguarding services what the system goal is, they tend to say protecting children. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just not sure it's ambitious enough. We can protect, and we do indeed protect children up until the age of 18. But what are we doing to prepare those children for a happy, healthy, safe, fulfilling adulthood? The research would suggest we could do a lot more. Do we have joined-up systems analysis paying attention to dynamics, or are we lost in static data? I'd respectfully suggest that some of the risk matrices doing the rounds currently are very much static data, based on, if we're lucky, intelligence, and often conjecture. It's alarming to me that we have quite so many spreadsheets flowing around the country with the names and unique identifying information of young people who had the misfortune to once have a friend who may or may not have been gang associated. I'm not sure that's what we want for our citizens. Are we avoiding creating irreversible emphasis? Well, fortunately, it wasn't irreversible, but we certainly have seen the creation of emphasis in ways that haven't helped your officers do their job as effectively as they want to. A good example might be the emphasis on missing from care that was, a preoccupying force a couple of years ago. It was right that we focused on missing from care. Children were going missing from care. As corporate parents, it was the duty to protect them. In focusing on missing from care, we rather missed a trick that many of these children were going missing from home. Indeed, thinking about that research and development arm that people who want to hurt our kids seem to have, what quickly happened was those who were exploiting young people, criminally and sexually, but particularly criminally, found other ways to do it. They were allowing those young people to then go and register for tutorial first thing in the morning, and then leaving school to undertake the criminal activity they become ensnared in, returning for afternoon tutorial sessions to log back in again. We've had reports from elsewhere in the country that some young people involved in particularly organised criminal gangs and groups now have undertaken paper rounds with branded, official-looking paper bags. So they pop out in the morning, between 7 and 8:45, they're selling drugs, they go in and log into tutorial, they're marked as present on the school register, then they nip back out again. This adaptive, and frankly, not to sound too glib, this innovative and nimble approach to hurting our children needs to be matched by an equally nimble and innovative approach to safeguarding them. We have to be ready to adapt quickly. I'm not sure if we've paid enough attention to the potential side effects of our actions. Sometimes, painful though it is to acknowledge, some of our efforts to safeguard young people and young adults may have created unfortunate unintended side effects. A good example would be the use of out-of-area placements, secure placements. Now, I want to be really clear, the use of out-of-area placements is sometimes absolutely necessary. Your officers will know all too well. Sometimes you run out of options and that child cannot be kept safe on your patch. I understand that. But too often, we're using out-of-area placements as if they will fix the problem, when of course they don't. They contain the problem. They protect that child for as long as they are in that setting. But we do very little to prepare that child for their return home, and return home they will, of course. I think it's really important that we consider authoritarian action. In our efforts to particularly tackle criminal exploitation, county line, serious youth violence, there is a danger, of course, waiting for us, a trap laid out for us, if you will, that we could inadvertently tip into authoritarian action, the disbenefits of which we'll experience for decades, generations to come if we're not careful. And of course, the $64 million question, how can we act with humility and future consciousness, applying foresight and transformative innovation in the face of unpredictability and uncontrollability of complex dynamic systems? When it comes to safeguarding our teenagers and our young adults, this is a complex, uncontrollable system. We cannot arrest or inspect our way out of this. There isn't a protocol or flowchart in the world which will make this mess neat. Your officers know that all too well. It's why we need system leaders like yourselves to engage with this complexity, to see it in the round. Another way of thinking about that system is the role that you as system leaders have in enabling evidence-informed practice. This is from some work we did for the Early Intervention Foundation a few years ago. We were asked to go and investigate and explore within 5 or 6 local authorities how they use evidence in safeguarding children. I rather suspect the Commissioner was hoping for a nice, neat list, That's not what they got. They got a complex story. They got a narrative which involves multi-level use of evidence. One of the areas that we don't pay good attention to necessarily, although I'm willing to bet there are some exceptions in this room, is the way strategic leadership and political leadership, the top of those, the top two tiers of that triangle, how they are crucial in setting the tone for the use of evidence in protecting children and adults, through vision setting, the way resources are allocated, the way costs and risks and benefits are assessed, how investment decisions are undertaken, how local needs and capacity is assessed, and how the use of research and theory and practice wisdom is woven through the entire system. Just like relationship-based practice or trauma-informed approaches or evidence-informed practice, none of these things exist only in practice. They rely on and require the leadership of colleagues like yourselves. And if we think about that system goal again, I find this quote from Bronfenbrenner quite helpful. Bronfenbrenner was a psychologist who really pioneered the notion of systemic thinking and the ecological approach to children's lives. And I like this quote a lot because I find it really grounding. When I'm getting a bit too highfalutin and academic, I remind myself of Bronfenbrenner's thinking. Bronfenbrenner says, to develop normally, a child requires progressively more complex joint activity with one or more adults who have an irrational, emotional relationship with the child. Or put another way, someone's got to be crazy about the kid. That's number one. First, last, always. Someone's got to be crazy about the kid. And that's not on your social workers or on your early help workers or on your youth workers or on your teachers. That's on you as well. And I know you feel that keenly every day. It's not for me to try and improve on the work of Bronfenbrenner, but I would respectfully suggest that that's as true as adults as it is for children. We all need someone who is absolutely unconditionally bonkers about us, who's got our back, who's in our corner, and who will go out to fight for us when necessary. Your officers very often are that person. For some of these young people, especially those young people who might be, this is a difficult term to use, they might be young people who don't necessarily invite a protective response from adults. They might be harder to feel protective towards. They're the ones who need your leadership most. And I'm not sure we've designed a system that makes it as easy as possible for those young people to feel that someone is absolutely crazy about them. I'm not sure we've designed a system that makes it easy enough for our professionals across councils and partners to feel absolutely crazy for these kids. And forgive the use of the word crazy, it was the 70s. Things have changed. If we were to design this mythical system from scratch, and I'll leave it entirely up to you where you want to draw the boundaries, big believer in local innovation, me, we would suggest this system might look a bit like this. I want to be very clear, this is not a model. I have some nervousness about the term model. It seems to suggest that you can buy it from Minnesota, where someone's done a randomized control trial, then you can plonk it into the middle of Margate, and then the magic will happen. And when it doesn't, you can blame the practitioners, of course. I don't think models necessarily help us sometimes. We need contextual, complex adaptation. This is more like a framework for thinking. Well, first and foremost, we would suggest this framework for a new system would be evidence-informed. Well, fairly obviously, I would say that, wouldn't I? Let's do a bit more stuff of what we think might work for some people with a fair wind. And be clear, colleagues, that's all evidence is ever offering you. What might work best for some people with a fair wind based on the current available evidence, which is subject to change. It's not quite so snazzy as what works, I appreciate, but that is what evidence offers you as system leaders. We would say this system would be contextual, or you could say ecological. The point being, it recognises that our young people and our young adults face harm outside of the family in their wider contexts. I know that many organisations represented in this room are already part of the thinking around adopting contextual safeguarding, a piece of work spearheaded by Carleen Furman at Bedfordshire University. What her and her team's work shows is that too often we've been taking an individualistic approach. If you've got 12 kids who've been hurt in a particular stairwell in a particular block of flats, rather than picking off the kids one by one, we need to address the stairwell. If you shut your youth centres and McDonald's are still doing free Wi-Fi, your kids are in McDonald's more often than they're where they should be, according to your local youth offer. That means you might need your fast food outlets on your subgroup for safeguarding. It demands different creative notions of partnership and makes a real, I think, a serious issue of safeguarding being everybody's business. If you are lucky or unlucky enough to have a Primark in your town, the bloke on the door of Primark needs to know the indicators for CSE as much as your local teachers do. Really thinking expansively about who our partners are. Secondly, this system would be transitional, you could say developmental. The point being, it's a system which absolutely honours and reflects everything we know about young people and young adults' development. Just like we did in early years. It wasn't that long ago that some bright sparks looked at the early years system and said, hang on, we know loads about infant development and infant attachment. Why don't we design an early years system that actually speaks to that evidence? We've never done this for adolescents or young adults. And it requires, I think, some realignment across systems, whether that's around how your Safeguarding Adults Board interacts with your Children's Safeguarding Partnership, or, for example, in the case of Bristol, the bringing together of their Children's Safeguarding Partnership, their Safeguarding Adults Board, and their Community Safety Partnership into one strategic place-based board. Thirdly, it would be relational. It would be person-centred. Now, the work your officers do, the projects they lead, the programs they commission and run, the paperwork they preside over, they're all very important, but it's people that change lives. It's the transformative power of relationship that really makes a difference, and that is led, as you know, from the top with feeling every single day. This approach would demand that we see relationships not just as a vehicle for intervention, but as the intervention itself. All of you, I'm sure, could give an example in your lives where what really made the difference was the human delivering the support more than the support. It would require us to be trauma-attuned, and being trauma-informed or trauma-attuned in practice, again, comes from the top with feeling. As kind of highlighted, I think, by Debbie and Stuart's input there, if we want really, really excellent practitioners, we need to create the conditions where they can be really, really excellent. There is scant point in saying we do trauma-informed practice, employing sheep-dip training, and then not offering trauma-informed supervision and leadership. This stuff is systemic, or we're not doing it, bluntly. Running all the way through it like a stick of rock, this system would be participative. Nothing about you without you, as they say. Giving people as much choice and voice as we possibly can, and that's particularly important with teenagers because, as you may know from your personal lives, trying to tell a teenager to just do anything gets you mixed results at best. In fact, if you found a way of simply instructing a teenager and getting your own way, you can sell that and bottle it. It tends not to happen. It's not like rescuing babies. And I would also highlight, literally highlighted, issues of equalities, diversity and inclusion. These have not been well attended to in our safeguarding approach across adolescence and young adulthood. We've paid too little attention to some of the issues that equalities, diversity and inclusion throw up. It is true, for example, that for many, many years we've battled with an under-identification of young male victims of sexual abuse, not least because our tools and our approaches were biased. I think it is a really pressing problem that we have issues around disproportionality of ethnicity data. The Charlie Taylor Review of Youth Justice showed us that. You are 11 times more likely to be charged under joint enterprise if you are a black man in this country than if you are a white man in this country. These are issues we need to contend with. For learning disabled young people and young adults, they are overrepresented as both victims and perpetrators of sexual harm. We can't get away from this stuff. We have to think critically about complex issues of equalities if we're to get this right. And as place-based leaders like yourselves, you are constantly thinking about your demographic, the nuances of your demographic, and what that requires for you as leaders. So the nature of complex contemporary adolescent risk means it's ever evolving. Bilston and others would argue that we're working within a child protection system primarily designed to meet the needs of younger children within the family. And again, just once more for colleagues in the back, we do not believe that you should renege on or not pay attention to the statutory guidance and frameworks around child protection. We just believe they could be better suited to complex contemporary adolescent risk. I think it's fair to say there's a kind of a tension within this. I find the work of Rees and Stein really compelling. This quote kind of breaks my heart a bit. When they looked at adolescent risk and safety, the teenager that your officers work so hard to keep safe, their emerging independence, their sense of invincibility for some teenagers makes them what Rees and Stein call imperfect victims. And I think that's really poignant, and I think it might be true. I think if we're really honest in this country, we like our child victims to look like children and act like victims. We need them to be about this high, with big eyes, and grateful, rescuable. I think our colleagues working in local government and wider partners are much more challenged by those child victims who are built like a brick outhouse, frankly, with a neck tattoo. I think that's a bigger ask of them. It's a bigger ask of them emotionally and intellectually. I think there is an imperfection to their victimhood, or rather an imperfection to how we understand victimhood. So thinking about those contextual factors, those structural factors, this is absolutely your bread and butter, of course, colleagues. We know that poverty is shown to have a strong causal effect on physical and mental health. I mean, put really bluntly, being poor makes you poorly, being poorly can make you poor. Being poor or poorly makes parenting even harder. Sometimes it's not much more complicated than that, is it, folks? We know irrefutably that poverty and inequality are linked to child protection and care rates. Again, something that I know that you battle with constantly in your local areas, trying to meet the needs of diverse communities. We know that poverty is linked to the sexual exploitation of adults, which in turn increases their experience of poverty. We know that there's a connection, a bidirectional connection between modern slavery and homelessness, your citizens being at risk of both and one begetting the other. We know that adults who are oftentimes having multiple needs and exclusions, or to use less humane language, high-cost, high-need adults, doesn't sit quite so well. We know that those adults not only have poorer outcomes in their adult life, but they are much more likely to have experienced adversity in childhood. We know who these adults are. They don't tip up and suddenly surprise us. We know who they are, you know who they are, your officers know who they are. The interconnectedness of these harms and adversities, and I could fill 3 more slides with this kind of contextual connected harms. We know this requires a highly integrated system of support, and we know that we need a lifespan perspective. We cannot simply ask our DCSs and our DASs to lead this. It's why we need council leaders, lead members, and chief execs to lead it. This is a corporate and place-based leadership issue. It's not simply one of children's or adult services. To be truly integrated will require us to blur some boundaries, and really, it's only you folks that have the clout to blur those boundaries. I don't think clout's a proper academic term, I should be clear. Now, this slide is the one that I always want to really apologise for. I'm sorry on a number of accounts. I'm sorry if you've got a 23, 24-year-old child or grandchild currently living with you rent-free. I'm afraid there is a good evidence base for those lifestyle choices. When we look at the research, and I've drawn here on the work of Sawyer and colleagues from the Lancet, there are other very good papers. When we look at the research around brain development, social trends, and various other sources of literature, what becomes clear is we've all been colluding with a convenient pretense for some years now. And it is a convenient pretense. We've always known it's a pretense. For a long time, we have tried to hold on to the outdated view that adolescence is about 11.5 to about 17.5, and we've designed our systems, our services, and our funding streams accordingly. The evidence now couldn't be clearer. Adolescence is not about 11.5 to about 17.5. Adolescence is about 10 to about 24, 25. But you knew that, of course. You knew that from your professional experience, and you knew that from any adolescent or young adult that you're currently trying to care for or even communicate with in your personal lives. And indeed, of course, for some colleagues it will extend longer than that. We're all on a journey. It's fine to have nuances. We can't unsee this now we've seen it. This requires radical system redesign and can only be led by colleagues like yourselves. This is not a job for social workers. This is a job for leaders like yourselves to enable social workers and other colleagues to operate effectively. We have, if you like, a gap. 2 planets. There's the child protection planet where, if we were to be really provocative, and clearly I've chosen to be, we could say that globally we're pretty good at rescuing babies from harming their family. Not convinced rescue is the right mentality, but it's certainly quite a pervasive mentality. And globally we are pretty good at it. You wouldn't spot that from the papers, but we are. There's the adult safeguarding planet now, really driven by the whole making safeguarding personal agenda that your DASs and your adults principal social workers are leading with considerable success. A person-led approach to safeguarding adults, one where we have notions of choice and control, and language which is frankly terrifying to your children's services colleagues, like risk enablement. We don't do risk enablement in children's services, we do risk management. So you have 2 planets which rarely speak to each other. And this gap down the middle there, that's where our 15, 16, 17, 18, 22, 23-year-olds are falling down, because the most basic premise, of course, of system design is that people fall through gaps. That's why we try to avoid having gaps. I want to home in on an issue that I know is vexing many of us, and colleagues like yourselves in system leadership roles will find this challenging. I've chosen here to focus on knife-related homicides, drawing on the ONS data set. It's a lovely whizzy website with all sorts of interactive graphs. There are particular challenges, I think, facing counties as a result of some of the extrafamilial harms, CSE, criminal exploitation. The nature of import-export of criminality and harm is changing for counties. It presents you with new and unique challenges. When we look at this graph here, and this shows knife-related homicides of the last 10 years, the red line up there, and you'll get these slides afterwards, the red line at the top there, 71 souls who lost their lives to knives last year, shows us that by a country mile, the citizens who are dying most and fastest as a result of knife-related homicides are 18 to 24-year-old males. And far from being everybody's business, they are nobody's business. They're not a children's safeguarding issue because they're over 18. They're not an adult safeguarding issue because they don't have care and support needs with a capital C and a capital S. But they are our citizens. For interest, the line below it is males aged 25 to 34, and the line below that is males 35 to 44. But yes, tell me again why this is a youth knife crime issue and not a male knife crime issue. The system goals have not been calibrated very effectively. Sticking with that theme of how safeguarding interacts with criminal justice, because of course, like all your work, this is about boundary spanning, not just spanning the boundary between children and adults, but spanning the boundary between safeguarding and law enforcement. This is drawn from the Justice Select Committee report in 2016, a particularly good select committee, in my view. And they were looking at 18 to 25-year-olds in the custody population. On the left-hand side there, you can see in that grid, they looked at, in the general population amongst 18 to 25-year-olds, the rate of things like learning disability. About 2 to 4% of us in the general population in that age group have a learning disability. Of the young people who are incarcerated, it goes up to almost a third. We know that in the general population, around 5 to 7% have a communications impairment in that age group. Of those that we have incarcerated, it's anywhere between 2/3 and 90%. Autism, ADHD, head injury involving loss of consciousness. Up to half of the 18 to 25-year-olds we have incarcerated have experienced head injury involving loss of consciousness, compared to under a quarter in the general population. This is adult social care's bread and butter. And yet, very often you will find that adult social care colleagues are not having their skills and talents brought to bear on those that we have locked up. In fact, many of these young men, and they are disproportionately young men, of course, not women, many of these young people, we knew them. They didn't have their condition diagnosed until they were in prison, which is a damning indictment, really, on our system approach to lifespan, needs, and vulnerability. We knew these adults. They didn't tip up suddenly at 23. We knew them. We haven't created a system which makes it easy enough for our colleagues to track and support those young people across their lifespan. And of course, this quote here from the Transition to Adulthood Alliance says, exactly as you and your officers know, young adults involved in the criminal justice system have often themselves been victims of crime. They are very often those who've got a history of being exposed to violence, domestic abuse in the home, neglect, bereavement. Bereavement's a really big issue amongst our young adult males in the prison population. As an aside, I was doing some work in a local authority, not a county, recently, about this issue, and there was a head of their gang service who had earlier on in the day explained that about a dozen young people had witnessed 2 very, very violent murders. And later in the day he explained how he'd immediately shared that intelligence with a national organisation involved in criminality and addressing gangs. And across the table, his colleague from Adult Social Care, who's in the process of commissioning a trauma-informed bereavement service for adults, said, "But you didn't tell us." And the head of the gang service said, "Well, gosh, no, I suppose I didn't. But it's a gangs issue." And she said, "But you're telling me we've got about a dozen adults who are about to become 18, who've witnessed the most horrific murder imaginable. Do you not think they might be likely contenders for our new trauma service?" And this gangs team manager, who's by no means, atypical, said, "That's just not how we think, I suppose." And he's not unusual. The way in which we set up funding streams and performance management systems, all the rest, it drive particular professional behaviour. So your helicopter view is imperative to ensuring that we're joining the dots across these needs. There are particular things that we can learn from the adolescent brain. I would really caution against reductive use of neuroscience. Your colleagues in children's services will already, I'm sure, be drawing on neuroscience in their development of services. I suppose the key things to highlight here are, one, if it looks too simple to be true, it probably is. So beware for really reductive neuroscience. But on the other, whilst we're never trying to excuse bad behaviour, understanding the adolescent brain can help us advocate for the child behind the behaviour. There are good examples, I won't go into detail, but good examples of things like dopamine release driving our risk-taking behaviour. Dopamine's the happy hormone. So if you do exercise, colleagues, you will have a little surge in dopamine. If you eat posh, fancy dark chocolate, not the wagon wheels, I've spotted back office, you've got to get the good stuff, all right? That will increase your dopamine levels. Should you be so lucky enough to have a roll in the hay occasionally, this will also increase your dopamine levels. We've got, half a microgram between us, and that's only because the coffee's up next. Teenagers have huge spikes of dopamine, huge surges in their brain chemistry, and that might, to some extent, underpin some of their thrill-seeking, impulsive behaviour. That sort of thinking, that sort of critical thinking and curiosity is exactly what needs to be led from the very, very top of the system for your colleagues to enact it in practice. When we don't, particularly colleagues in system leadership roles, when we don't permit and indeed demand that kind of curiosity, that kind of complex thinking, we can do something really quite dangerous. We can oversimplify and we can miss stuff. We can miss the fact that some risk is positive. We do need our young people to engage in proportionate measured risk in order to develop. We can miss that some risks are what's called egosyntonic. They meet a need for those young people. This is a really challenging one. One of the things that young people tell us again and again in the research around sexual and criminal exploitation, they frame their needs in attachment terms. They don't say, well, of course, I was falling foul of my attachment drivers. Of course. They say things like, I thought he loved me. He was my boyfriend. But they're my crew. I belong with them. They can protect me, you can't. They are articulating attachment needs as part of their motivation and drivers for becoming ensnared in gangs and being particularly vulnerable to perpetrators of sexual abuse. And yet we don't talk about attachment very much in our work with teenagers, certainly not as much as we do in our work with younger children. And we very rarely talk about attachment for our young adults. Something really scary can happen, though, and this is something you absolutely want to be alert to what you're leading from the top here, the notion of choice. The notion of choice is quite a dangerous one in this territory. We ascribe it far too easily and we don't interrogate it enough. We sometimes are using language which suggests that young people are making rational adult lifestyle choices, and I'm not sure that we can stand up to scrutiny. For some young people, it's not a choice, it's an adaptation to earlier harm. A good example would be a young boy who's lived with domestic abuse is more likely, the research would suggest, to develop a sense of hypervigilance. He thinks his world is really dangerous, because it was, frankly. Those young people are more likely, the Alien Intervention Foundation would suggest, to become ensnared in gangs because of their perceived protective benefit. Put simply, the world's really scary, those fellas look nails hard, I'm better off with them than not. That's a very solid logic model, I'm sure you'd agree. A very rational, evidence-informed self-preservation strategy. It's not quite the same as choosing to consult with negative and offending peers, but that's what officers will write down if we're not leading a different culture from the very top. Sometimes it can be a maladaptation to earlier harm, for example, where young people have experienced abuse or neglect. And sometimes it can be a young person meeting their unmet needs the only way they know how. And we need to be really honest, we play quite fast and loose with adolescent capacity. When it suits us, criminal responsibility, of course, when it suits us, they understand complex choices between right and wrong from the age of 10. When it doesn't suit us, depending on your view around voting age, for example, or other things, we choose to decide that their brains are not fully formed. Now, I'm not here to argue one point or the other, but I do think we deserve some consistency. It seems slightly bizarre that we can send a young person to the army at 16, but they can't watch the full cut of Terminator 3 in case the guns scare them until they're 18. I think our kids deserve some consistency and intellectual rigor in how we advocate for their capacity. And these young people know all too well that we're getting it wrong. They are absolutely clear in the work we've done. They are not simply talking about better pathways from disability services or better care leaving services. Those two things are very important. What they're highlighting to us again and again is that all young people who've experienced harm and risk need to have a much more fluid transitional approach. Max here, a young man, in fact, from a county council, telling a room full of social workers at a conference with me last year, I was in care all my life, and you really did keep me safe. You wrapped me up tight in bubble wrap. But I'm 19 now, and I kind of feel like I can't move my arms. This young man will be in contact with adult services in one form or another for the rest of his life. He doesn't have the language of making safeguarding personal, choice and control, risk enablement. We did a cracking job of protecting him, but we did nothing to prepare him. The system goal wasn't calibrated. Aisha there, care experienced young adult, highlighting, I think very, very wisely here, now I've left care, I get really lonely. It's a big thing for my safety, but no one talks about it as safeguarding. Your colleagues leading adult services are exceptionally good at recognizing that loneliness is a key issue for safeguarding of our older adults. We are not always understanding what a key safeguarding issue it is for our younger adults. Aisha has a very, very clear causal pathway. She describes how the biggest thing that affects her safety is, and I'm going to paraphrase because her language is a little bit colourful, the key thing for her safety is that she gets together with blokes who aren't good sorts. And the reason she does that is because she is so desperately lonely. And our offer to her was cookery lessons. And as she said in her own words, do you think I needed cookery lessons? My mum's Jamaican. It was a mockery. That's sort of what she said. She understands her pathway to protection. She understands that the system isn't offering it. And she's absolutely right. This last comment I find heartbreaking. Unless you're worried about my child, I won't hear from you lot again. And I think she's got us banged to rights. As soon as she, in Aisha's case, turned 21 rather than 18, she had care leaving PA in place, we dropped her. And until we think she's not a good mum, she won't see us again. She's nowhere near the threshold for adult safeguarding. We need to think about that. We can't turn away from it now we've seen it. And a young woman here from the north of the country, couldn't wait to get to 18. I thought that once I was an adult, everything would change. Hasn't worked out that way. I wish I was a kid again so you could lock me up. I would respectfully suggest, colleagues, that when our young adults equate safety with being locked up, we might have got the safeguarding bit not quite right. We have to be thinking about these lifespan perspectives. What could we do? What could you do? Well, the things you are doing are already helpful. Deliberative and deliberate learning from other services and parts of the system where transitional approaches are more embedded. So your special educational needs and disability services, for example, whilst by no means an easy part of the system to lead, we will never go back to walking away from disabled children at 18. It's unconscionable that we would go back to that. There's so much learning from that. The emergence of 0 to 25 mental health provision, for example, increasingly vexing and rewarding your commissioners. It seems highly unlikely we will return to not supporting care leavers beyond the age of 18. We've already made progress in so many fields. Safeguarding is one of the few parts of the system where we hold on to a very binary, almost old-fashioned notion of childhood and adulthood, as if you magically become an adult on your 18th birthday. Transition, of course, is a process, not an event. And you know this because you can remember it. Well, can you remember waking up on your 18th birthday? One gentleman very much can't remember it. I don't mean to trigger anyone in the crowd at this point. That feeling you had, it wasn't a cider and black hangover, of course, was it? It was capacity coursing through your veins. You suddenly made rational choices and were totally equipped to keep yourself safe in the world. Of course you weren't. Transition is a process, not an event. We could do much to draw down the best of our adult safeguarding practice into our work with adolescents. The Making Safeguarding Personal agenda is, to my mind, really synonymous with the Nolan principles. It's about rights-based approaches, citizenship, enabling people to contribute to their communities. The focus on well-being, not only welfare, I think is very, very welcome. In children's safeguarding, there's a number of really excellent innovations which colleagues in this room have been involved in, or their places have been involved in. Contextual safeguarding and complex safeguarding, where we look at harms, lots of different harms collectively, and try to create a holistic response. Much of that could be drawn into our work with adults. It plays beautifully into the primary care network stuff and other parts of the NHS 5-year plan, and it absolutely speaks to your role as kind of whole place, whole person leaders. And that's really what this is about. You have to call it transitional safeguarding because people turn up to that session because everyone's scared of safeguarding. But really, it's about whole person, whole place ways of working, and no one can lead this apart from you. We could, painfully, reflect on how some of our interventions have been what in health they would call iatrogenic. Colleagues who've worked in or with health will know this word. Iatrogenic means when the medicine makes you poorly or the treatment exacerbates your condition. We don't have a word like iatrogenic in safeguarding, and I think we might need one. Because at the moment, your DASs and DCSs are trying their best to subvert two systems which were never designed to be connected, and they're working tirelessly to try and connect them. There will be officers in your local authorities who've had to place a young person many, many miles away. It's usually somewhere like Snowdonia. 15 grand a week, 5-to-1 supervision, because we ran out of options. They couldn't be kept safe in their community. And on their 18th birthday, or just before, your DAS, or someone working to your DAS more likely, will take one look at the bill and say, how much a week? She's got capacity. You bring her back to Woking right now, please. And of course, that young person, well, whilst we've protected them, we've taken care of their physical security, there are two other sides to that triangle. Their relational and psychological security. Taking care of them as people so that when they return to Woking, or somewhere in Cornwall, or North Allerton, that they are equipped with the self-worth, the critical thinking, and the relational skills that they can play a part in keeping themselves safe in their own place. This is your business. This is your bread and butter. Only you do this as well as you do. And crucially, and if we only had one message really for leaders like yourselves, we have to build back up the local capacity for system redesign and cost-benefit analysis and boundary-spanning problem-solving. We lost so many of our wonks in the first round of cuts. Those number crunchers, those people who could tell the stories for investment, we lost much of that capacity, and we urgently need it back. I was talking to a DCS recently who said that she is allowing all of her CSE survivors, her child sexual exploitation survivors, to stay in contact informally with the CSE service. Some of them are in their 30s now. I said, what are you filing that under in the budget? And don't ask. And I said, how are you getting away with it? She said, I haven't taken any of their kids into care yet. It pays for itself. She just can't prove it because she hasn't got the data analyst to do it for her. If you only invested in one thing to support this kind of innovation, it must be your analytical capacity. The business case writes itself. And of course, the reason why it writes itself is because of the investment argument, which I'll come to. Just briefly, and this again comes from your kind of cultural leadership here, we have to be focused on self-efficacy, giving people the tools to be part of their own solution. Teenagers and young adults as partners in their own safeguarding, but not responsible for their own harm. That's the sweet spot right there. That's citizenship, I guess. That's what you preside over. And it does sound a bit expensive, doesn't it? I get that. It does sound a bit expensive to do anything that we're not currently doing. However, what we're doing now is not exactly great value, put bluntly. What we're doing now is eye-wateringly expensive, as you know all too well. When we stop safeguarding support at 18, those young people do not cease to require resource. They tip up in our mental health population, our homelessness population, our substance misuse population, and of course our criminal justice system, the one service with no waiting list. We are still spending precious resource on these citizens, and had we ever realised the vision of community budgets, of course, you'd be able to see all this at a glance. It takes real leadership, I think, to really analyse the whole place, whole person expenditure, but by doing so, the business case writes itself. It is true that we are seeing an increase in safeguarding adult reviews of young adults, but of course only a tiny proportion get a safeguarding adult review. These are our citizens, and we cannot allow them to be harmed or indeed to die simply because we didn't have the wherewithal to redesign the system. You have done bigger and bolder and braver things than this in your careers already, colleagues. I urge you to think about the role you can play in redesigning a system which is truly transitional and person-centred. And no pressure, but a bit of pressure, if I'm honest. We know that we can't safeguard all people through statutory means, nor arguably should we. Not everything that looks like safeguarding has to be done by the council or by social workers within that council. For safeguarding to truly be everybody's business, we have to be completely differently re-engaging with our communities. 50% of children subject to a serious case, we didn't have a social worker, but they all but one had neighbours. What role can our communities and citizens play in redesigning a system which truly meets the needs of this age group? We do not want to be paternalistic, and we do not want to widen the net so that everybody receives statutory support, but we do need to create whole places where people can be safe and can contribute to their own safety. And it requires, of course, visionary leadership, but you're not short on that. If not now, then when, colleagues? The platform is already on fire. Your practitioners know this all too well. The research couldn't be clearer. This speaks to your core moral purpose. And this is the real pressure point now. If not you, then who? Counties have always been the first to innovate, to show leadership, and have shown admirable heft when negotiating with central government. Again, heft may not be a proper academic term. It's only really you that can make these changes. We can sit around waiting for new policy or new legislation, but I understand they're a bit tied up at the moment with some other bits and pieces. So let's do what you do best. Make a bit of rain on the ground. You've always led the most innovative and exciting endeavours in the system. I would encourage you to make transitional safeguarding one of them. Thanks ever so much for having me.
We are slightly overrunning, but I don't think any of us would complain about that. I've just got the one question which has come in, so I'll just restrict it to that. And it is this. Do you think the lack of diversity in system leaders, for example in this room today, is creating barriers to understanding and change?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think that that is in no way intended to make anyone in this room who absolutely got their job on merit feel anything other than proud that you do the job you do. But I do think as system leaders, there's a real imperative to ask yourself hard questions about how representative your workforce, your leadership team, your wider partnership, kind of strategic boards, reflect the needs and demographics of the citizens you serve.